Right then, I believe this is where we left off in the last video. Having been introduced to the antagonizing armies, finally the British forces shall march into battle. Roll the clip. Stop the clip. No, they've already got something wrong. Oh dear, this may take a while. The command is shouted, "Forward march," at which point we see the entirety of the British line commence their advance. But who is this command being given to? It's just being cried out to the heavens to anyone who happens to hear it. Now, it would make a lot more sense if this was just one company or other small group in isolation from any others, but this is very clearly a larger force made up of various companies of men who, realistically speaking, would also come from a number of different regiments to form a brigade of infantry. And we'll get to why those men should be coming from different regiments a bit later on in a future video, but for now, given that this is a large group consisting of a variety of different organizational levels, every command ought to be qualified first and foremost with an addressing of the group of men who ought to follow that command being issued. For example, if our man wanted to first push against the enemy line with his best shock troops before following up with the rest of the brigade, he wouldn't just call forward march because another company might hear that and commence their own advance. Instead, the correct command in that situation would be Grenadiers or Grenadier Company to the front, quick march. The chain of words first gets the attention of the men being addressed. It tells them what they are going to do, and it tells them the speed at which they are going to do it. In this case, where the entirety of the British line is advancing as one, the command would be something a bit more like, "The brigade shall take care to advance. Brigade, to the front, quick march." And of course, if there was more than one brigade, which would be sensible, you would go one step further and address either the 1st Brigade or 2nd Brigade, the left brigade, right brigade, so on and so forth. And that's not the only thing that's wrong with this command being issued. Assuming that we fixed the first half of the command and it becomes brigade, forward march, well, now we know who is meant to be doing the forward marching, but at what cadence are the men to carry out this action? In British drill from the American War of Independence, there are 3 distinct steps or speeds at which you can march. You have the regular or the slow march, you have the quick march, and you have the march march. And the precise speed of these steps can vary depending on which manual you read and exactly when it's relevant, but generally speaking, the regular march is carried out at 60 steps per minute, and was most commonly applied on the parade ground, or I imagine in the earlier phases of a battle where haste and speed may not be as necessary. The command here would simply be march. Think of this step as the default pace for an army. The quick march is double that speed at 120 steps per minute, and this would have been the most common for standard maneuvering in the field of battle. And finally, the march march is the quickest speed, and what might be called as the men are charging bayonets and approach much closer to enemy lines, and it is done at 140 steps per minute. So, technically speaking, the command issued here ought to be for a quick march, because the command for a regular march would instruct the men to advance at 60 steps per minute, not the 120 that was clearly desired here. Now, that being said, while this is a technical drill error, it's not necessarily an historical one. Not only would the precise speed of these various steps alter throughout the years from manual to manual, but the exact way of describing them would as well. For example, while the command to have men advance at 60 steps a minute would generally only be march, there are historical cases of the command actually being called slow march, and in this case, when you distinguish the regular step as a slow march, presumably in relation to the more common quick march, perhaps it means that the word quick can actually be dropped off. In this situation, march, in standing for the quicker step, would be distinguished from slow march, rather than march being distinguished from quick march. Indeed, this is the way that most reenactments groups actually do it these days, because the regular step, the march, being primarily a parade step, is so rarely used that if you want the men to engage in it, it's usually very specifically commanded as slow march. In a reenactment, when you're in the field, the command will usually just be to march, and it's implied that this refers to the quick march. March is still used in its appropriate sense, although in the past it's also been used as an excuse to just sort of take off in a jogging step of sorts, whereas the true march, again being 140 steps a minute, is really more of a very brisk walk. So while it's not technically incorrect to hear the man say march and have that stand for quick march, it would have been nice to see the distinction there, I think, because again, it would be a distinction. Is the only way in which you're going to say march to stand for a quick march is if you are very specifically with that group of men referring to the ordinary time, if you will, of 60 paces a minute as the slow march. Because otherwise, if you just say march, and it could mean either or, well, all of a sudden half the army is advancing at a very brisk 120, and the other half is lagging behind in the more formal 60. But in any case, my goodness me, we haven't even made it past the first 5 seconds of the clip. Oh Lord, let's see if we can't progress a little further this time, eh? Stop, no, oh, these packs. Now, I do really like that we have an acknowledgement here that soldiers' packs like this did exist. Not many reenactment groups have them because they aren't really vital to the majority of combat-oriented impressions. And I don't think that would have been terribly common for men to actually wear their full marching order when they're going into battle. But then, perhaps it was early on in the war like this. I'm not terribly certain. Maybe they would have worn them into battle. I'm not going to comment on that. But what I am certain of, though, is that this man's pack is being carried very low on his back. If this period's full marching order packs are anywhere near as uncomfortable as the Napoleonic-era pack, and something tells me that they are, then wearing it this low on the back like this becomes very rapidly quite uncomfortable, even painful. Many packs like this had a problem where not only did they have to carry a great deal of weight, but the straps which held them up were also very, very thin. They dig into your skin, and I have many fond memories of my arms very nearly going numb as a result of wearing one of those packs for an extended period of time. But this pain is very much alleviated when the pack is held at a proper height, very high on one's back. The same way that a school child's backpack ought to be carried high on the back instead of slouched all the way down. It's better for your posture. Taking a look at how low this soldier is wearing his pack, I can guarantee that unless the thing is completely empty, he's not going to be having a very good time. On a similar note, as the scene progresses, we get a much better look at the packs that all of the other enlisted men are wearing. While I liked the appearance of the goatskin packs that the men towards the rear were wearing, as I've heard of plenty of cases like that during the 18th century, these packs here look far more modern in their design, almost like they belong more in the Victorian era. I mean, they could be authentic, but the perfect box shape like that, the fact that they're so very small and have nothing in the way of protection against the rain, indeed you can see just here that they're even open at the top, well, I'd be surprised if they were period appropriate. They look much more like modern-day satchel bags made to resemble Victorian military packs, rather than the monstrous and miserable things that are more appropriate to the 18th and early 19th century. These things that these men are wearing, they just look far too comfortable and convenient. It's in this same shot that you can very clearly tell that the music playing in the background, an interesting rendition of the British Grenadiers, which I actually quite like, although I've seen it be quite controversial, was in fact, and this is sadly often the case, added into the scene later on in post-production. You can see just here that the men very rapidly fall out of pace with the music. That's because they're not actually marching to the same tune. Indeed, you can also make out on quite a few marks that men are just falling out of step entirely with one another. And not that men falling out of step is wholly inaccurate, of course. After all, it's a very difficult thing to maintain one's step, and a very large advance like this would oftentimes have to stop to dress and reform their lines as they went to ensure that proper cohesion was kept. But the extent that some of these men are out of step is absolutely shameful. To be so far behind at this early stage of marching that you're stepping with your right when you ought to be stepping with your left, well, it's very clear that some of these men saw fit to step off on their right foot instead of their left, and this is never to be done. In all military steps and movements, even in the present day, you always step off on your left foot, and don't you forget it. But perhaps we're being too cruel there. After all, it would certainly be much easier for the men to keep in proper step if only their drummers were positioned correctly. I do always appreciate the showing of a massed band, but while such may be appropriate for a parade or while on the march, it is not proper to have all of your musicians in the same location when in an engagement like this. Instead, these musicians ought to be spread across the line, with each company having one or two drummers each behind their lines. Each individual group of men then receives their own step to follow, and they have their own means of communication with the other companies. Oftentimes at an advance, you wouldn't expect the whole line to step off perfectly like this, but instead you would see individual companies step off according to the pace set by their individual drummers. And as the whole line advances, the drummers may steadily sync up their pacing, and the entire line may slowly fall into step. But with all of the musicians massed into one large center block like this, it's really no wonder that the wings of this formation have difficulty keeping the true pace, to say nothing, of course, of the fact that it takes time for sound to travel. But so far, this has been an awful lot of negative, and I'd like to mention something that I actually do like about this scene. First off, all of those problems aside, well, it just looks stunning. The colors flying, the red lines stretching across the open field, and the music playing as the infantry begin their advance. It reminds me of that ever-famous scene from Barry Lyndon, and don't worry, I'm sure we'll get to that one eventually as well. And what's more is that unlike so many popular renditions, in which have every British soldier wearing a bearskin cap, we see here a very clear distinction between the grenadiers and the battalion men. As you may well know, every regiment of foot during this time period consisted of 10 companies of men. There were 8 battalion companies, and these made up the bulk of the regiment and always formed its center. There was the light company. They were light infantrymen who were on parade, always formed up on the regiment's left wing. And then there were the grenadier company, consisting of the tallest men of the regiment, who always took up the position of honor on the regiment's right wing. And here we're actually seeing this being followed, a full grenadier company in the proper position in this army. Now, that said, it was actually far more common in the war to have the light infantry and grenadier companies from a variety of different regiments brigaded together, and they would oftentimes not be advancing with the main force, but instead serving in special roles, like, they being the vanguard or the rear guard, as shock troops, as screening forces, that sort of thing. Although that was especially the case with light infantry, more so than with the grenadiers. But even with that being said, it's still really great to see the grenadiers in their proper position in this line, and so very distinctly so. And there we have another thing that I just love about this scene. Now, I have no clue what our Sergeant Major first says there, and I've listened to it many times trying to determine what it is he says. But the second thing that he shouts, I understand quite clearly. Keep your dressing, he urges the men, taking care as he moves down the line to watch that his men are in proper cohesion. It's that sort of attention to detail that I wish we would see more often in films, because all too often an infantry advance is, after the initial commands have been given, dead silent outside of the music and the pounding of boots on the ground, including, by the way, in Barry Lyndon. There's a dead silent advance. But just because everyone steps off at once doesn't mean that the line is going to be perfectly straight the entire time. That's why you have to have NCOs throughout the ranks, keeping a constant eye on their men. When advancing, you need to constantly ensure that no men are lagging behind, and to check any overzealous men from advancing too far out of ranks. Cries of "mind your dressing" and "keep ranks there" would have been ringing out as the line goes forward, lest the formation slowly lose its cohesion and arrive at its target as more of a blob than a line. So bravo there, keeping proper check on your men, Sergeant Major. Though why the sergeant major is roaming down the line like this, I'm not terribly sure. It doesn't seem like a terribly good idea, because even with his spontoon very clearly marking him out, it's important that he remain in a set location so that he, as the senior NCO of this force, is able to quickly and efficiently receive his orders from the officers who are actually leading this force. Every man, NCO, and officer would have a very specific position within a line for that exact reason. In the chaos of battle, you need to be sure that you know exactly where the important people are. Which is also, of course, one of the biggest reasons to have things like ranks, spontoons, colors, and different uniforms to distinguish between the different ranks and where everyone belongs. So let's move on for a bit, see how far we can make it. Oh, darn it. I was really hoping to have this video end on a positive note, but, well, it looks like I was a bit over-optimistic there for a while. Tell me why, when well over half of the men are already at the present, the issue is just being issued for the men to make ready? The proper string would be to first make ready, at which point the men holding up their pieces to the sky would cock their muskets, and then, and this is what we should be hearing here, either present or, as in the case of the rebels, take aim. Then you may level your muskets, and then the command, of course, would be to hold your fire or fire or whatever. That's when that can progress. But even then, for those men who hadn't already leveled their pieces, they seem to take the command to make ready as the sign to do so. And what sense does that make? It seems that most of these men had missed their own training sessions as well. Oh well, I suppose that's what you get with militia. At least it's nice to see the Grand Union flag flying there. I mean, not many people know it exists, so it's nice to see up there. Well, it's gone and happened again. I've been prattling on for however long now, and we haven't even gotten to the actual battle. But we will in the next part. That much I promise you, everyone. We will reach the battle in the next video on this scene. But until that cataclysmic moment, I am and I shall remain, my dear viewer, your most humble and obedient of servants.